Welcome, everyone. My name is Jean Garrison. I direct the Office of Engagement and Outreach at the University of Wyoming. I am also a professor of international studies and political science, and because we're up here in Sheridan, I always also note, not only am I a graduate of the University of Wyoming, I am a graduate of Tongue River High School. So it's really nice to be home. When we come back up to Sheridan, it's always to a great crowd, and I just have to say that I thank you for welcoming us back. This is probably my 12th year doing programming up here in Sheridan, and it really came from a commitment of wanting to make sure that what we do at the University of Wyoming comes out to our communities. And I say that so you know that there are a lot of us doing it, and the initiative to open the Office of Engagement and Outreach is precisely that. The commitment to our communities and goal 3 of the strategic plan, which is impacting communities. And the creation of my office, and I guess the job I currently have, is a manifestation of that vision and the continuation of that. 2 years ago, the College of Arts and Sciences and the Office of Engagement and Outreach, which was me at that point, announced the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Project. This was coming off of many years of another initiative which bears that name, and that is the Malcolm Wallop Conversations and Democracy program, which was supported very much by those who loved Malcolm Wallop, his staff and his friends and his family in particular. So what we're building upon tonight in this conversation is his legacy as a public servant to create a program focusing on significant discussions around the state on issues of public interest. I can't think of a topic, at least in my world, political science, that is more relevant than really thinking about our democracy, but our democracy in comparative perspective, because there are a lot of trends that are global. A lot of trends that are local or global and back. And so that's one of the commitments that we have is to make sure that the conversations that we bring out to Wyoming communities focus on a number of issues. The Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program includes hosting and an expert in residence at the University of Wyoming, and tonight you're meeting our Fulbright scholar who is really the Millward L. Simpson chair this year in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. There's a commitment to funding faculty research and also student research. A lot of it's been international research. You'll be meeting 2 of those folks tonight as well as part of the panel. And the model for this program is the keynote from Dr. James Arvanitakis, but then we're going to have a panel discussion that sets up some kind of different perspectives on the issues that he raises, and then after that we'll open it up to Q&A. The other commitment is what we have in this room tonight, and that is to bring these conversations out to our constituents, our citizens in the state of Wyoming. So I'm really pleased that this is really almost to the day 2 years ago when we launched this, and it ends up being a very special partnership up here in Sheridan because of course, the home of Malcolm Wallop. So we're building on UW's commitment of community engagement to have this conversation tonight. It's really important to acknowledge and just to say thank you to a few folks. First of all, I want to thank Sheridan College for being our partner continually in these programs. I want to thank in particular Amy Albright, Sarah Sinclair, and our many supporters who are in the room. These events could not happen without the support of a lot of people. I also want to put out a shout out to Mike Thomas, who is a government instructor up at Sheridan High School. He welcomed us into his classes, and he and his colleagues. We were in an awful lot of American government classes yesterday. I met, it was about 200 students, roughly, that we saw, and had an opportunity to bring this kind of conversation to students as well. So I want to thank Mike. Where is Mike? All right, there he is. I want to say, thanks to Mike and Mike's students who are here tonight. We really are really pleased to have you here tonight. So the commitment of the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Project is to make sure that we have events like this, but we really get into schools. And so the partnership with faculty at high schools as well as at the community colleges is pretty important. There are 3 or 4 seats up here in the front. So one last piece of housekeeping, and that is that we are filming this tonight so that we will have it and we'll be able to post it at a certain point. This will go around to other communities, so we will have a mic going around when you're asking questions because we want to capture that. Also, you have a feedback form in your chair as well as the program, and I encourage you to turn that in to us before you leave this evening. So, having said that, let me go ahead and turn to our speaker tonight. Dr. James Arvanitakis, who is from Western Sydney University. As I noted, he is a 2019-20 UW Memorial Simpson visiting Fulbright professor. Professor Arvanitakis is in the leadership of the Graduate Research School at Western Sydney University. He is also a lecturer in humanities and a member of the university's Institute for Cultural and Society. James was also the founding head of the academy at Western Sydney University that received an Australian Financial Review Higher Education Excellence Award. One of the things that I really noted when James joined us, and James is at the university for this whole academic year. He's been awarded the Prime Minister's University Teacher of the Year Award in 2020, and that's across the whole continent and country of Australia. His research areas include citizenship, resilience, piracy, and the future of universities. He's actually teaching a class at UW on the international relations of space. That's the current class. And he's authored a number of articles and a number of books. I could say more, but I'm going to let him say a little bit about himself that gets us into the topic of democracy, looking at institutions in our talk, which is democracy in America and around the world. Please help me welcome James Arvanitakis.
Thank you, Jean, for that lovely introduction and welcoming us all. I want to begin by thanking the Sheridan community for making us feel so welcome. The last few days have been just brilliant. I want to specifically also thank Sarah Sinclair and Mike Thomas for inviting us into their classroom, which is such an honour to be invited into someone's classroom, and they hand over their students to you, be it for 45 minutes or an hour and a half, and to spend time with those students and share knowledge, it is a real honour. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm always incredibly humbled to stand in front of an audience. I've met a number of you the first night we arrived, which was on Sunday, through to today. And I often, when I meet and have these conversations with people, I think, oh, I've got nothing to say. They're so much smarter than me. So I always feel a little intimidated. So I hope I can add something to the conversation. And it is a conversation. It is a conversation about the future of our democracy. Apart from working at a university, I also have a segment on the equivalent of PBS on both radio and television, so the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And one of the things that I have been doing is doing live crosses from Laramie back to Australia once a month to talk about my experiences here. I also have a regular newspaper column as well, and I write an article every 3 or so weeks. And part of my mission has been that so much of what we get from Australia, from the US, either comes out of New York, Washington or Los Angeles, and so very little comes out of other parts of the United States. And so part of my mission has been to share the different stories, the different experiences, and the different, the diversity of people across this amazing nation. And it's a real honour to be here. So I will start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I was the first member of my family to go to university. I didn't even know what a university was, to be honest with you. My parents didn't know what a university was. My mum ironed for a living, and my dad carried bricks for a living. But as first-generation migrants, they saw this as an opportunity for safety, for security, and sort of encouraged me to go to university. I had gone to an all-boys school, so the main driver for me going to university was it was co-ed, and I knew there'd be girls there. So I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I want to go there. So I worked at a university for about, after university I graduated and I ended up entering the world of finance, and I was an economic forecaster working with trying to keep financial institutions liquid and moving money around different Australian financial institutions. I also have an accent. I recognise that you may hear this, so if I say something you don't understand, please let me know. The chances are it's this strange Australian accent that people seem fascinated by. The second thing that happened, after about 10 years, I left the university and I left the banking sector, and I went and travelled around the world and came back and worked for a number of environmental and community-based organisations. And so I got into a whole bunch of programs about dealing with, I suppose, young people who had had a tough time and had sort of fallen on sort of, I suppose, a wrong track, and I worked with them to sort of introduce a whole bunch of programs around, be it community theatre or using different programs to try and get them re-engaged into education. And it was at that point that I became an educator, and this is me graduating from my PhD. You can see how happy I am. I used to say this was the happiest day of my life, until 3 years ago I married my wife. And when I said in a speech about a month after I married her, I said, oh, this was the happiest day of my life. And it was an audience like this, and she went, so now this is the second happiest day of my life. As you can see, that's a very, very happy James. And being an educator, I think, is feeling amazing about working with young people in a really important time of their lives, be it at high schools or universities. And so I'm really honoured. And speaking about my marriage, it was actually 3 years ago to the day that we got married. And I promised Alex a beautiful dinner. That's why we came to Sheridan. And instead she gets to hear me speak for an hour. So, but thank you for putting up with me. Okay. A little bit about Australia before moving on. Unfortunately, you can't see that very clearly, but that's Australia down there. This is our map, for those of you who aren't aware of our map. You'll see that it's the Union Jack from the British flag, and that is because Australia never had a war of independence. It was granted its nationhood in 1908 by England, and so we remain very, very tied to England, and our systems of government is very much reflective of what happens in England. Second thing about Australia is that we are about the size of the United States, mainland United States, but we only have 25 million people. So the way I've been describing it to people is like we're a giant Wyoming, right? There's people, it's most of Australians, and I'll show you another heat map in a moment. 90% of Australians live in cities. Right, so we have much of the country is very sparse desert that no one lives there. We are a migrant nation. Almost one in four Australians was born in a country other than Australia. And so where I teach at my university, it's on the outer western suburbs of Sydney, and it's incredibly diverse. And in one of the classes that I taught, 400 students, 198 different languages spoken in that class. So that is a real strength because it ties all these links to different nations, but it also creates its own challenges and problems. If we have a chance, I'm happy to talk about, because some of my work is focused on that. As I said, 90% of Australians live in cities. So this, unfortunately, that's a bit light, but if that's the continent of Australia, you can see that most of our population, Sydney and Canberra are here, about 5 million there, 5 million down here, about 3 or 4 million here. So you can see out of 25 million people, most of us live on the coast in big cities. There's a little sort of place here called Broome, and that's a little sort of mining settlement there. And essentially, if you could drive across there, it'd be like driving from Seattle to Cheyenne without running into anything, right? So that's how sparse it is. So it's an incredibly sparse continent. But we have 150 million sheep. That's not important. I just want to share that fun fact with you. This was what Australia looked like before colonisation. We had about 120 different Aboriginal and First Nations peoples that had different languages, different religions. The people down here essentially were agriculture and had permanent or semi-permanent settlements. People in here were nomadic because they lived in the desert and moved to different water sources. And one of the interesting things with Australia is that we never had a treaty with our First Nations people. And when we forced some people off the land, and a whole bunch of people off the land, we forced often warring nations together to share the same land. And that's kind of created layers and layers of complexity in Australian culture that we still haven't sorted out. And there's discussions about going back and trying to sign a treaty to try and sort out some of the more complex issues. And up here there's an island, for example, where the people there were historically very fierce and were historically very warlike. And there's a bunch of people that were forced from this area onto the island to live. And that conflict has continued for 120 years because the people being forced on the island, they have no claim to any land and are essentially treated like squatters. Now, I just wanted to say that not everything in Australia wants to kill you. That's something that all the students here say. When I asked them, what do you know about Australia? The first response was, everything in Australia wants to kill you. These are some of our very cute marsupials, okay, including the quokka, and there's a photo of Alex and I with a quokka. They are the friendliest animals in the world. I'll maintain that. But in saying that, a lot of things do want to kill you in Australia. So when you come and visit, just be prepared that there are some things there that do want to kill you, including crocodiles that grow about 6 metres long. And this one, I sent Jean an email the other day from our security at the university, which warned us when we see a snake not to pick it up. It didn't say if you see a snake, it said when you see a snake. And one of the classrooms I teach in, it's actually in the basement level of one of the buildings. And we used to, have the air conditioning on normal temperature. And then we went into that classroom one day and found about 25 snakes because they go in there to keep warm. And so now what we do is when we go, before we close up the classroom for the night, we turn up the air conditioning to the highest possible level. It's the only way to keep the snakes out, right? So yeah, so lots of things do want to kill you in Australia, but don't believe everything wants to kill you. Okay, so I want to tell you 6 things about Australian government that I think, or Australian politics, that I think is really interesting, and you can compare it and contrast it. But despite these similarities and differences, you'll also see that some of the challenges that we face are not that dissimilar. The first thing is that we have compulsory voting, and that means that once every 2 or 3 years, we actually go out as a whole nation, have to vote. The moment you turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. Now, Australians being Australians have turned the regular voting into a sausage-eating competition. And so what we have is we have our Democracy Sausage Day. That's how we describe our elections. And so every time there's an election, and this is our Prime Minister, and this was our opposition leader, and this was just before leading up to the election. And there was a big news story that the opposition leader didn't eat the sausage in the proper way. And this caused controversy. This sort of was a lead news story on a number of our sources. So compulsory voting is an interesting one. Second one is that we don't directly vote for a Prime Minister. We actually vote for our local Member of Parliament, our local parliamentarian. And whoever ends up with the most seats, they're the ones who have elected the Prime Minister. So that's a really interesting, that means that if the Prime Minister loses popularity, that they can gather and replace him without an election. And that happened like 8 times in 10 years in Australia, where we kept on changing prime ministers without election. So you'd go to sleep one night, and you'd wake up in the morning, and there'd be a news flash saying, there's a new prime minister. So it was kind of difficult to explain to people around the world that it wasn't a revolution or an election, it was just the quirky nature of Australian politics. This also means that there's no difference, there's no separation, there's no executive. So we have a very different separation of powers to the United States. So if that's the parliamentarians from the current government, and basically the executive, which are these people here, are part of the government. So there's no separation between them. So that actually creates all sorts of tensions because in some ways the Prime Minister isn't held to account in the same way that, say, a president can be held to account in the United States. Fourth thing is we have no Bill of Rights, and there's a big campaign to try and introduce a Bill of Rights in Australia. So when our rights are infringed, it has to go to court, and court cases rely on precedents, but we have no document to refer to. And there was a big push, a big parliamentary inquiry, and something like 80% of Australians supported a Bill of Rights, but it coincided with increase in the introduction of a whole raft of security measures, and so the government refused to introduce it. And this again creates a whole bunch of problems for Australian people and our relationship to the government. The fifth thing is this is a bit of a strange one. Technically, our head of state is still the monarch of England. So our constitution refers to the monarch of England as our head of state. And we had a referendum probably about 15 years ago to replace the monarch with an Australian head of state, equivalent of a president. And overwhelmingly, Australians supported not to do that and keep the Queen. So I think we're the only country in the world to ever elect a Queen. so it's one of those odd things about Australia. I suppose it is an interesting thing about how constitutions, written at a certain time, don't keep up with the way that the world changes. But Australians, we very, very loyal to the Queen. I'm a Republican and I'm not a fan of the Queen, but I also understand why Australians see this monarchy particularly as a sort of sense of stability in a kind of an unstable world. And so, if anything, her popularity and the popularity of the British monarchy has increased. The other thing about Australia, you can't really see this, so that's not important, but the reason I just put this slide up is because Australia has a really big government and lots of government services. It's a very different country in some ways, culturally. So we have 25 million people and we have Medicare for all. We also have compulsory savings, retirement savings. So even when you're 16, if you start working at McDonald's or you start working at Wendy's or something like that, and you're only working 4 days a week, or 4 hours a week, say, and you get part of your tax goes into a retirement savings account. And the idea being that the government wants people to retire independent of, and then employers are required to meet the contribution of your tax. And so this kind of retirement savings has created billions of dollars for the government to invest in Australian infrastructure. So it's been one of those things that's acted as a really important stabiliser. Australia has experienced something like 25 years or 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth. So even during the Great Recession, having these funds to draw upon and to actually invest in infrastructure kept our economy going. So there was massive amounts of government investment in infrastructure during that time. So we actually avoided the worst of the Great Recession, which I think was partly a bit of luck and partly some very, very good management at the time of the government. Okay, so I want to talk about 5 big challenges facing liberal democracies around the world. And I think as I do this, I want you to, I will be referring both to Australia and the United States, but there are some really interesting trends that I think are across liberal democracies everywhere we look, be it the UK, be it throughout Europe and other places. Okay, so one is a fracturing of media. Now, we've known this has happened for a long time, but why is this so important? Well, there was a theorist called Benedict Anderson who talked about how nations form, how countries come together. And what Benedict Anderson argued was that when you have one of the key ingredients to bringing nations together is to have a shared story and a shared identity. And newspapers became one of the most fundamental ways to achieve that. Because when you pick up a newspaper and you read it, you read about other people across your country. You have a shared language. People are reading the same things. They have an understanding of the same challenges that they face. And so when they have conversations, they may disagree, but at least they're reading the same thing. The fracturing of the media means that we now have, in countries like Australia and the US and other liberal democracies, people actually reading different stories. It's not just reading different issues around the same story, it's actually reading radical different stories. So a few weeks ago, I did this quick search on the internet. I looked at the New York Times. Top story, was the impeachment process against President Trump. I went to Fox News. Fox News had it about halfway down the page. I went to Breitbart. It didn't have it at all. Okay? This fracturing means that we're having different conversations. And if the essence of having a nation is actually having a shared story and a shared identity, when the media begins to fracture, that shared identity ceases to exist. And this is really important, especially in vast nations like Australia and the US, where people are so far apart physically that those shared stories begin to break down. So we start feeling that we don't have anything in common. Now, this slide here, this image here, highlights what's happened to newspaper circulation. The purple one, the darker one is weekday news, and the lighter one is for Sundays. And you can see the radical break sort of towards the end of the 90s, where this is fallen dramatically. The other thing that's happened, this is a heat map showing what you read depends on your political leanings. So the blue is the Democratic voters, the red are Republican voters, and it just shows that in what they're reading essentially is the media that suits them. So this fraction of the media means that we get caught in our own echo chambers. We read the news, and the algorithms that exist within the news on our feeds means that we are directed to read the sources we agree with. Now, this is increasingly challenging because, as the next slide shows, newspapers, network television, and local television are all declining dramatically in their usage. What's increasing is cable television and digital news. That continues to grow. So in Australia, there was a survey done that something like 75, 80% of young people under 25, their major source of news is social media. And they're reading the social media, that they click on the things they like, and the social media algorithm is learning what to give them to read. Nothing different from what they read, just the things that they agree with. So we are actually creating two nations, depending on our political beliefs, because we're reading two different stories, or we're now becoming two different cultures. Where once the news brought us together and gave us a shared identity, what we're getting now is a separation of that identity. And again, this is a trend around the world. The second thing is a declining level of trust. And trust is one of the research areas I've really been fascinated in. These different lines show, the blue one shows the media, the red shows non-government organisations, the green one is business, and the purple one is government. So the purple one in government, you saw the increase and then the fall. So government has never been, this is in Australia, this is by Edelman, and it does both an Australian survey and a worldwide survey. This is based in Australia. But what's really interesting is a decline of trust in the media again, right? So things happen here that sees trust fall, but what remains consistent here is an increasing trust in corporations, but again, they're beginning to fall. And this line here is really important because this line here is a 50% line. Once you cross that line, that means more people distrust something than trust something. And again, in the Edelman presentation, if you go through their worldwide report, this is a global trend that more and more people are distrusting the sources that they once trusted. But as Jean reminds us in a lot of the presentations we've been doing in the last few days, is that this has always been a problem. It's probably marked more now, but it's always been a problem. This is what they call a trust gap, and it just shows that trust has always been, there's been a gap between those who, what we call informed readers, people who take time to read the news, and people who are sort of the more mass population. So there's this trust gap has always existed. So it's not a new challenge, but I suppose the extent of the challenge that becomes different. And this is a slide we've been sharing with the students, which is from the Pew Research Centre, and this goes back to the 50s, trust in the United States. And you can see that there's times, you can track the year across here and probably track the political event we all know about, Vietnam, the Nixon years, up here's the Reagan years, back down. This is around 9/11, and then again it's been declining. And you can see that this decline here is now hitting record levels. Now, what's interesting in this research is that this is reflective by both Democrats and Republican voters. So it's a declining trust. Now, why is trust so important? Trust is so important because you trust someone when you believe that they're acting in your best interest, right? Or the best interest of the nation. We now have a situation where less than 20% of Americans believe the government is acting in their best interest or the best interest of the nation. It's very hard to govern a country like that. And you combine that with the fracturing of the media, you begin to see how the challenges begin to develop. The third is the rise of partisan politics and the rise of the term primaried, which is something that's happening in Australia as well as the US. And this was something that Al Simpson spoke about when he was in Laramie a few weeks ago. Essentially, both major political parties do this in the US and also in Australia, and it's happening in liberal democracies around the world. Essentially, if you compromise, if you're willing to walk across the aisle and work with the opposite side, you get attacked in the primaries and replaced in the primaries. Now, if compromise becomes what's going to unseat you, why would you compromise? So partisan politics is not just about how things are happening, it's also, we're seeing something that's going to have a massive effect into the future. And both, these are two politicians that have done some pretty impressive things, or doing impressive things. But both of them have used the concept of using the primary as a weapon to stop compromise. And so we wonder why our political leaders don't compromise is because they're under threat. If they do, that they're going to be replaced in the primary process. And again, this is something that happens in Australia. It's a term that we call stacking the pre-votes. You bring in a whole bunch of people to vote against the sitting person that is willing to compromise and work with the other side, and you replace them with a cultural warrior. And so compromise becomes a dirty word. The fourth one, I think, is a really important one, and this is a global trend around the OECD, and that is a decline of the middle class. And again, some of these are a bit hard to read, but this shows a ratio of middle class earnings compared to sort of more wealthy upper middle class, upper income households, and how that's been declining as a proportion. And you can see that that's a consistent decline going back to 1985 and continuing. This chart stops at 2016. Now, this is Australia. This is a stark reminder. This is income of middle class families. This is the cost of living. Okay? So look at that. That's a massive impact. And it's not just things like, new cars are more expensive. Unfortunately, this slide shows you where those costs are, and they are in education, that's the green one, health, the red one, housing, the green one, and the other one's an average. So you can see that it's also really, really important parts of our lives that place people under pressure. And this one's a bit hard to see, but this shows a vulnerability index, and it says across the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Development, that 4 in 10 households, 40% of households, if they're hit with a $2,000 unexpected bill, they will go bankrupt. So if you've got a child and they break their arm, or if you've got a car and it blows its gearbox, you can basically not make your household repayments. Right? 4 out of 10. Incredibly vulnerable populations. So the middle class is not what it once was. The gap between the middle class and I suppose losing it all is now incredibly thin. Incredibly thin. So we have this incredibly a vulnerable population out there, and they're feeling the pressure. They're feeling the pressure. And this comes out in all sorts of surveys. So when we see surveys about people being angry or people being frustrated or people feeling vulnerable, that statistic really scares me. This is the fifth one, and this is based on survey work I've done specifically in Australia with young people. And it's looking at how people increasingly feel that politicians are not understanding their challenges, their day-to-day challenges. And so we did a massive survey 10 years ago, and we've been following it up quite regularly. And what we're doing, we're asking people, do you think that politicians that are making decisions on behalf of our lives, do they think they understand the challenges that you face? Do you think they understand things like the cost of living, education, finding a job? And what we found was this growing gap, and that gap continues to grow. It continues to grow. So people are feeling that they're not being represented. They don't have a voice. And in Australia, there's been this really interesting trend for the last, say, probably 2 decades, and I don't think it's as pronounced here. But, you know, if you look at the Australian Parliament, say, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, that Parliament was made up of, you know, people that had been politicians for a long time, but in there you also had teachers and lawyers and retired police officers and, you know, small business owners and corporate executives. So you had this incredible diversity of experiences. The average politician in Australia today goes to university, picks a side. They either join the young conservatives or the young liberals, right? Will graduate from law, will go and work either at a legal firm, either a conservative legal firm working as an anti-union firm or a pro-union firm, will then become an advisor to a politician, will then become nominated to be a politician, and then will become a politician. Right? Something like 87% of Australian parliamentarians have some sort of legal background in that way. How do they represent a broad, diverse public? That's a question. And the question is, they don't, and they're not doing it very well. The experience that they've had and the experiences that we've had are radically different. This is just a way that I've been using to describe this kind of growing gap between our everyday experiences. And I didn't have the chart to sort of show you this trend, but this trend's growing and continuing to grow. So how do we respond? Is it doom and gloom? I don't think so. I'm actually naturally an optimistic person. And after spending the last 2 days here with some of the students in Sheridan, my optimism grew rather than disappeared. So what are the things we can do to respond? Okay, one is the powerful role of higher education and what I call the Citizen Scholar Program. So the Citizen Scholar Program is a program that I developed in Western Sydney University, and Jean mentioned in the introduction that this was the program that we won the award for the Academy. And essentially what it argues, the role of universities and higher education, be it college or university levels, is 2 things. One is scholarship, but 2 is citizenship, to promote a sense of empowered, active and engaged citizens. So how do we do that? And we don't see those things as compromising. We actually see those things as being mutually reinforcing. So the role of universities is not to just produce scholars, not just to teach theory, but to take that theory and apply it, to make students and academics and professors accountable and working closely with the public and taking on real challenges. And this is one of the reasons I suppose I'm so excited to be working with Jean and Jason at UW. It's been one of those great experiences because this is what they're passionate about. So in the curriculum, we build challenges that force students to make decisions. One example is recognising that literacy can no longer just mean reading and writing. It has to mean understanding big data. It has to mean understanding and having the ability to understand what's fake news, what's real news, how to assess different sources. It's no longer just enough. So we've moved from a time of information scarcity to a time of information abundance. So how do you teach students to do that? There was a survey done in Australia that showed that 6 out of 10 students under 18 only ever looked at one source from their social media feed and didn't follow up that source to test if it was real. So first impressions count. 4 out of 10 said, what do you trust the most? Which news source do you trust the most? 4 out of 10 trusted the internet ahead of their parents or their teachers. That's a scary thing. If people are just reading what they read at face value and it's their most trusted source, then there's a whole bunch of problems that follow. And the other one here, just quickly, I mean, you can see things here. We have everything from critical thinking to ethics to aesthetics and interdisciplinarity, communication. But this one here, mistakability, is teaching students or working with students to understand from their mistakes. What often happens is we give them an essay, they respond to the essay, we do some marking and they hand it back. Well, we've designed courses at the university which actually, without the students realising it, it's almost impossible to pass. It is impossible to pass. So what we assess them on is how they react to that failure, right? How they learn from their mistakes, right? And so we assess process, not outcome, right? Because everything in life is about process, right? It's not just the outcome. And so you're learning about the process, and that's been a real challenge. And we've had to really change the way that we approach our curriculum to do that. And I think this is fundamental. Now, part of this is the idea of brave spaces, not safe spaces. So I know this has been a debate in higher education here. Safe spaces is about making sure that no one's offended. Brave spaces is admitting that education makes you uncomfortable. That the people in that room should be encouraged to ask complex questions. They should be encouraged to ask those questions even if they're clumsy. They should be encouraged to ask those questions in a respectful way, but in a way that says, ask that question. Because if you can't have that conversation in a university, where can you have it? If you can't have that conversation in a room with your peers, where can you have it? And so what I see often is young people getting tongue-tied when they disagree with someone because they don't know how to debate. And the reason they don't know how to debate or discuss things is because they're not allowed, or they've kind of haven't been encouraged to do it in the classroom. So part of this was saying, let's be brave, not safe. Let's be safe in some ways, but also be brave. Let's take some risks. A term I use, and a lot of my colleagues don't like this term, and I hope you know what I mean when I say let's politicise the classroom. Let's bring politics into the classroom and encourage people to discuss things. And let's not expect everyone to agree, but let's find ways that we can agree to disagree. And I think that's really, really powerful thing that education institutes can do. The third thing is to reclaim the centre. And I honestly believe that this is still possible. The project that I have when people talk to me in Australia, they ask me, what's your project then? I say, to reclaim the radical centre, to stand in the middle and get hit by both sides of traffic. I don't mind that, right? And as I say, my close friends who are conservatives call me a radical, and my friends who are far left call me a conservative. So I think I'm getting it right, okay? And there's lots of ways we can do that. And I'm actually encouraged. This is a survey from look, again, the detail doesn't matter here. This is a survey from an organisation called More in Common. They did a large report in the US politics about 3 years ago, 3 years ago. And what they found was only 8% of progressives and 6% of conservatives would refuse to change their position. Right? The rest of us are totally there to be convinced to go one way or the other. Okay? The centre is where people want to be. So the political processes that have been encouraged are discounting that centre. So the evidence is there that the centre is where we want people, where we want our politicians to be. We want them to compromise. We want them to give. But the processes that have been introduced take that away. The challenge is, as Beverly Gage says from Yale University, is that it's hard to rally people behind compromise, pragmatism. Right? It's hard to get people. Come up with a chant that says, "Hey, let's compromise." It's very hard, right? I've tried. It doesn't work. Refocusing on the middle class, and again, the detail here doesn't matter. This is an interesting proposal by the Brookings Institute about how to re-empower and create a new sort of safety net for the middle class. It's a combination of removing some taxes and introducing new taxes. Yeah? Now, what's really interesting about this was not so much what they proposed, was the reaction. The reaction, because they had a combination of new taxes and removing taxes, both major parties attacked the report. Right? So again, it means that we're not even having these conversations. If you read some of the conservative media, basically this was a socialist threat. If you read the more progressive media, this was a radical neoliberal reform. Okay? I mean, that's not a conversation. So refocusing on the middle class and having that conversation, I think, is incredibly important. And the final point I'll make, and we'll hear from Lucas in a little bit, is about understanding the next iteration of social media. So much of what we do is linked to social media. And the problem with social media is that it has become a bit of an echo chamber and created a whole bunch of, I suppose, unpleasant discussions, to put it mildly. But social media also is an amazing way to empower people to communicate. Right? So we shouldn't throw out the technology just because there's problems with it. We need to assess how we can use social media to empower people to communicate. And there's programs, for example, in Australia where we know that organisations like the police and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and other trusted organisations in Australia, they share information. And when there's a crisis such as a bushfire, right, people know to go to these sources and trust those sources only. It's also being used really effectively by some groups to engage with disengaged young people. Some of the work that I do, for example, is working with radicalised young Muslim men and using all sorts of different forms of art to re-engage those young men. And also radicalised sort of white supremacists. Again, using social media to find them, to work with them and to engage with them rather than using it as a tool, using it as a weaponised tool. It's about trying to bring people into conversations. So they're the 5 solutions. Thank you very much.